The church bell began ringing before sunrise. Not for prayer, not for celebration, but for judgment. On a cold October morning in 1734, in the colony of Boston, a wooden cart stood beneath the gallows at the edge of the common. The crowd gathered in silence, men in wool coats, women in linen caps. Children lifted onto shoulders so they would remember. The condemned man did not struggle. He stared at the sky. And just before the rope tightened around his throat, he whispered a name no one in the crowd recognized. Ashford. The trapdoor dropped. And with it, something far darker than a single life ended. What the townspeople did not know what the magistrates would bury. What the clergy would deny was that this execution was not justice. It was containment. And it would not be the last death tied to the Ashford family. Colonial America between 1700 and 1780 was a world balanced precariously between faith and fear. The British Crown ruled from across the Atlantic, but daily life was governed by local assemblies, Puritan sermons, and strict social hierarchies. In Massachusetts, morality was law. Public confessions were common. Blasphemy could bring ruin. Suspicion traveled faster than truth. In towns like Boston, Salem, and Newport, reputation was survival. The Puritan worldview left little room for ambiguity. God rewarded obedience. The devil exploited weakness. If misfortune struck a failed harvest, a stillborn child, a house fire someone had sinned, or someone had invited something in. The Ashford family arrived quietly in 1728. They were not wealthy enough to be envied, not poor enough to be pitied, just visible enough to be remembered. Edmund Ashford, the patriarch, claimed to be a merchant from Bristol. Records confirm a vessel docking that year carrying textiles and iron tools. His name appears in shipping ledgers stored in colonial archives. He purchased land just beyond the central parish, near a wooded stretch bordering tidal marsh. It was not prime property, but it was isolated. His wife Eleanor rarely attended church gatherings. When she did, she spoke little. Observers described her as educated nobly so for a woman in the colonies. She carried herself with composure that unsettled the other wives. And then there was their son, Samuel Ashford. 10 years old when they arrived, old enough to observe, young enough to be underestimated. Colonial law in Massachusetts was shaped by English common law, but infused with religious authority. Ministers influenced magistrates. Sermons shaped verdicts. The line between civil and spiritual guilt was thin. In 1731, a revised legal code reaffirmed strict Sabbath observance. Missing church could result in fines. Open criticism of clergy could bring public punishment. Witchcraft prosecutions had declined since the hysteria of 1692, but fear lingered beneath the surface, and fear as a currency easily spent. The first rumors surrounding the Ashfords were small. Livestock found mutilated along the marshland. A neighbor's barn catching fire under unclear circumstances. A stillbirth whispered about behind closed doors. None of it could be proven. But each misfortune found its way eventually into the same sentence. They lived near the Ashfords. Samuel grew into adolescence under the watchful eye of a community that had already judged him. Witness accounts preserved in fragmented diaries and parish notes describe him wandering alone near the shoreline at dusk, collecting strange objects, speaking to himself, or perhaps to someone unseen. One account from 1733, written by a deacon Matthew Hale, describes encountering Samuel in the woods. The boy was kneeling, drawing symbols in the dirt. When confronted, he erased them immediately. But the true fracture point came in the autumn of 1734. A local dock worker named Thomas Whitaker was accused of theft several crates of imported molasses missing from the harbor storehouse. Molasses was not a trivial commodity. It fed the rum trade. It supported colonial commerce. Theft threatened economic stability. Whitaker denied the charges, yet witnesses claimed they saw him near the Ashford property the night before his arrest. Under questioning, Whitaker grew desperate, and in desperation, he spoke a name, claimed Edmund Ashford had coerced him, claimed there were meetings held in the woods, claimed the Ashfords practiced rituals forbidden by both Crown and Church. No physical evidence surfaced. But Whitaker's confession given after prolonged confinement was enough. When a colony where fear of hidden corruption simmered beneath the veneer of piety, the accusations spread like wildfire. Edmund Ashford was summoned before the magistrates. Records showed no formal conviction, yet within weeks, Thomas Whitaker was executed, and Edmund Ashford was never publicly cleared. This is where our story truly begins, because history tells us what was recorded, but it rarely tells us why certain records vanished. In the winter following Whitaker's death, 3 parish documents referencing the Ashford inquiry disappeared from church archives. Shipping ledger noting Ashford's imports was amended. Names struck through, margins burned. Accident, perhaps? Perhaps someone higher in the colonial hierarchy had reason to suppress further investigation. The Ashfords did not leave Boston. They remained quiet, observant, and increasingly untouchable. Our protagonist enters the story not as a hero, but as a skeptic. Jonathan Mercer, a junior clerk to the colonial court, educated at a modest grammar school, devout but not naive, tasked with copying court transcripts and preserving municipal records. Mercer believed in order, in truth documented, in law applied evenly, began noticing discrepancies in the Ashford-related files. Dates altered, testimonies shortened, entire pages replaced. In 1735, Mercer made a private notation in his own journal. Something festers beneath this town's righteousness. He did not yet understand how deep the rot extended, or how dangerous curiosity could become. To understand the tension of this era, we must remember the broader colonial climate. The 1730s were marked by religious revivalism, the beginnings of what would become the First Great Awakening. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards stirred congregations with sermons on divine wrath and moral reckoning. Emotional intensity filled meeting houses. Sin was no longer private, was theatrical, public, contagious. And in such an atmosphere, accusations did not require proof. They required narrative. The Ashfords fit a narrative. Educated outsiders, living on the edge of town, connected to unexplained events. But narrative alone does not explain protection. Because despite suspicion, despite whispers, no formal charges were ever successfully brought against them. Why? Who intervened? Mercer's investigation grew quiet but persistent. He interviewed Whitaker's widow. She revealed something peculiar. In the weeks before his arrest, Thomas had claimed he was being watched not by townspeople, but by men dressed finer than any dock worker. Men who arrived at night. Men who carried documents bearing official seals. Seals Mercer recognized, not from the church, but from the colonial governor's office. At that time, Massachusetts was under the authority of Governor Jonathan Belcher, appointed by the Crown. Political tensions between colonial assemblies and royal governors were constant. Trade regulations, taxes, smuggling all simmered beneath polite discourse. If the Ashfords were connected to something larger, something political light would explain much. But it would also mean Mercer was stepping into territory far beyond parish scandal. And then came the second death. Eleanor Ashford was found lifeless inside the family home in early 1736. Official cause, fever. Unofficial whispers, poison. No autopsy was conducted. Colonial medicine lacked both precision and skepticism. A body could be buried within hours. Samuel, now a young man of 17, did not weep publicly. Witnesses described him as composed, almost expectant. Edmund Ashford retreated further from public view after his wife's death. Jonathan Mercer's notes reveal a chilling detail. On the night before Eleanor's burial, Mercer claimed to have seen Samuel near the courthouse, steps alone holding a folded document sealed in wax. The seal bore the insignia of the crown. What agreement had been struck? What leverage did the Ashfords possess? Or were they merely pawns in a wider colonial conspiracy, one tied to trade routes? Smuggling rings? Or covert political networks resisting British oversight? History leaves us fragments. Fragments that suggest the Ashford name surfaced again in connection with maritime insurance fraud in 1742. Fragments that tie Samuel Ashford to a private shipping enterprise operating between Boston and the Caribbean during years of increasing tension leading toward revolution. And fragments that hint Jonathan Mercer disappeared from public records entirely by 1744. No death certificate, no transfer notice, simply absence. Was Mercer silenced? Did he uncover something he was never meant to see? Or did he choose exile over confrontation? We cannot yet say. What we do know is this: the Ashford family did not fade into obscurity. They evolved, adapted, integrated into colonial commerce in ways that made them indispensable and dangerous. Colonial America is often remembered as a battleground between liberty and empire, but beneath that narrative lies another, one of private alliances, of secrets traded for protection, faith used as both shield and weapon. The Ashford story is not about witchcraft, it is not about superstition, it is about power hidden beneath piety. It's about the machinery of early American society and the families who learned how to manipulate it. And we are only at the beginning. In Part 2, we will follow Samuel Ashford into the shadow networks of Atlantic trade. We will examine court transcripts long ignored. We will trace Jonathan Mercer's final known movements and uncover the connection between the Ashfords and a secret financial agreement that may have altered colonial politics in ways history textbooks never mention. But before we continue, consider this. If you lived in 1734, bound by church law, dependent on reputation, surrounded by suspicion, would you have questioned the narrative? Or would you have rung the bell yourself? Shh! You're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If this story unsettled you, let us know in the comments what you believe truly protected the Ashfords' power, influence, or something more deliberate. Like this video, if you value historical truths others overlook, share it with someone who believes early America was simpler than it seems. And subscribe to Liturgy of Darkness, because in Part 2, the documents get darker, and the disappearances become impossible to dismiss. History remembers the verdict. We uncover the motive. Stay with us. Winter settled over Boston like a verdict. The harbor froze in thin sheets along its edges. Ships arriving from London, Barbados, and Madeira sat heavy in the water, their hulls creaking against the docks. Sailors cursed the cold. Merchants counted losses. Trade was the bloodstream of the colony. Molasses from the Caribbean fed the rum distilleries along the waterfront. Cod dried on wooden racks for export to Europe. Timber, tar, and whale oil filled warehouses built from brick and timber frames. And every transaction passed through ledgers. Ledgers that could be altered. Ledgers that could be weaponized. Samuel Ashford understood this before most men twice his age. By 1738, he had inherited not only his father's modest shipping interests, but also something less visible: access. Access to private contracts. Access to customs officials. Access to correspondence, stamped with the insignia of the crown. Boston's architecture told a story of control. Meeting houses stood at the center of town, tall steeples rising above low timber homes. Windows were small, designed more for insulation than light. Streets were narrow, crowded with carts and livestock. The smell of salt, smoke, and tannery runoff hung in the air. The Ashford home remained on the outskirts, near the marshland, but it was no longer neglected. Neighbors noted renovations. A new cellar, reinforced with brick, interior walls thickened, an upper room sealed from the inside. No one knew why. In colonial Massachusetts, home modifications were not casual undertakings. Materials were expensive. Labor was communal. Any structural change invited curiosity. Samuel offered no explanation. He attended church more regularly after his mother's death. He sat in the front pew. He sang. He donated generously. Faith in colonial society was currency as powerful as silver. But Jonathan Mercer's absence left a void in the records. The junior clerk who once copied court transcripts had vanished. Officially, he resigned. Unofficially, his boarding room was found emptied in haste. Ink stains remained on the desk. A single page torn from his journal lay near the hearth, partially burned. It read, "They are not merely merchants." The rest was ash. Without Mercer's steady hand in the archives, discrepancies multiplied. Shipping entries altered after inspection. Customs fees waived without documentation. Insurance claims filed for cargo that witnesses swore had never sunk. At the time, the British Crown tightened its grip on colonial trade. Navigation acts required goods to pass through English ports. Smuggling was rampant. Colonial merchants resented interference. Political tensions simmered. Governor Belcher faced criticism from the general court. Wealthy families maneuvered behind closed doors, aligning themselves either with Crown authority or colonial autonomy. The Ashfords seemed to align with both. Samuel's name appeared in partnership with merchants known for strict loyalty to London, yet his ships were spotted docking at odd hours, avoiding inspection. Dual allegiances were dangerous, lest they were intentional. In 1740, the First Great Awakening swept through New England. Preachers traveled town to town, stirring emotion in crowded meeting houses. Congregations wept openly. Sin was confessed publicly. Ministers warned of divine wrath. Religious fervor destabilized traditional church authority. Old clergy resented the new evangelical style. Young men questioned established power. Samuel Ashford supported revival meetings financially. He invited traveling ministers to dine at his home. He presented himself as a patron of spiritual renewal. Yet beneath that display, coded correspondence circulated. One such letter surfaced decades later in a private collection, addressed not to Samuel directly, but to S.A., keeper of the northern account. The handwriting was precise, the language indirect. The shipment of timber is not timber. Sure, the lower chamber remains sealed. The governor's man must not see the west wall. Lower chamber, west wall. Mercer had once written about unusual modifications. Now those modifications carried new meaning. Colonial homes often included root cellars for food storage, but brick reinforcements suggested permanence, concealment. Rumors grew among dockworkers. Crates unloaded at night from Ashford vessels were heavier than declared ironbound, sealed with wax, marked as hardware or textiles. Yet no such goods appeared in local markets. Where did they go? Boston's political elite met frequently in private homes. Candlelit dinners where wine flowed and alliances formed. Discussions of trade tariffs, defense funding, and land speculation. Samuel began receiving invitations. He was young. The wealth accelerated status. By 1742, his name appeared in tax records among the upper tier of merchants. How had his fortune expanded so quickly? The answer may lie in insurance fraud. Colonial shipping insurance operated on trust and documentation. Merchants insured cargo against piracy, storms, or loss at sea. Claims required witness testimony and signed manifests. 3 Ashford vessels were declared lost within 2 years. Compensation was paid. Yet independent harbor logs showed 2 of those ships returning under different names to smaller ports along the coast. True, Samuel was orchestrating a complex scheme, declaring loss, collecting funds, rebranding ships, and redistributing undeclared cargo. Such operations required protection. Customs officials would need to look away, clerks would need to alter records, governors would need plausible deniability. The antagonist in our story does not appear as a cloaked villain. He appears as influence, as access, as the quiet nod of a man in powdered wig and tailored coat, a man whose signature carried more weight than any sermon. Though no definitive document names him, patterns suggest involvement from a high-ranking Crown appointee, someone positioned between London's directives and colonial enforcement, someone who benefited from controlled smuggling, using illicit trade to finance private interests. Samuel Ashford, then, was not merely a rogue merchant, he was a facilitator, a middleman between official authority and unofficial enterprise. Jonathan Mercer sensed this before he vanished. His internal struggle had been recorded in earlier journals. He believed in law, in moral order. But he also understood that colonial governance was fragile. If corruption at the top were exposed, it could destabilize the entire province. Was silence patriotic or cowardly? Mercer had grown increasingly isolated before his disappearance. Colleagues described him as distracted. He attended fewer social gatherings. He requested access to older land deeds, particularly those related to the marshland surrounding the Ashford home. Those deeds revealed something unusual. Property extended further underground than above. Original survey notes described a natural depression suitable for drainage. Later amendments reclassified it as structural foundation space. In plain language, a subterranean chamber. Boston's soil composition near tidal marshes made deep cellars risky. Flooding was common. Why reinforce one so heavily? In 1743, a violent storm struck the coast. High winds tore shingles from rooftops. Waves crashed against wharves. Several ships broke free from moorings. When the storm cleared, part of the marshland near the Ashford property had eroded, exposing brick, not random brick, engineered brick. A wall, half buried, facing west. The same direction mentioned in the coded letter. Neighbors reported seeing laborers working through the night to rebuild the embankment. Samuel supervised personally. No church elders were invited to inspect. No town officials recorded the repair. In colonial society, communal oversight was standard. Isolation was suspicious. By mid-decade, tensions between Britain and France intensified, leading toward the French and Indian War. Colonial militias prepared. Funds were allocated. Trade routes shifted to support war supply. Smuggling increased under the cover of military necessity. Ashford vessels secured contracts to transport provisions, flour, gunpowder, iron, but manifests rarely matched cargo weight. The line between patriot and profiteer blurred. Samuel cultivated an image of loyal subject. He attended public prayers for victory. He donated 2 militia supplies, yet his ships continued nighttime activity. And then, in 1744, a fisherman claimed to have seen lantern light beneath the marsh after midnight. Not in the house. Below it, as if light seeped through cracks in the earth. The fisherman was dismissed as drunk, but weeks later he left town abruptly. No forwarding address. Patterns of disappearance followed those who asked questions. Clerks reassigned. Dock workers relocating. Witnesses recanting. Fear in colonial America was not always loud. Sometimes it was procedural. A reassignment letter. A tax audit. Denied permit. Power moved quietly. Samuel Ashford married in 1745. His bride, Abigail Turner, came from a respectable family aligned with traditional clergy. The union solidified social standing. Marriage in colonial society was economic alliance as much as affection. Through Abigail, Samuel gained access to church leadership circles previously cautious of him. Through Samuel, Abigail's family gained trade connections. Yet wedding guests noted something peculiar. No one from Samuel's extended family attended. No cousins, no uncles, no relatives from Bristol. It was as if the Ashford lineage began and ended with those present. By 1747, whispers of rebellion began surfacing in taverns. Taxation without representation, trade restrictions, colonial autonomy. Samuel avoided public political statements. Neutrality preserved business. But neutrality can mask leverage. And then came the discovery. In late autumn of 1748, construction workers, expanding a drainage trench near the Ashford property, uncovered a collapsed section of earth. Beneath it lay a wooden hatch, iron-bound, weathered, but intact. The workers alerted a local constable. Samuel arrived before dawn. He insisted the hatch covered an old storage space. It's dangerous to open, unstable. The constable hesitated. Property rights in colonial Massachusetts were respected. Without warrant, forced entry risked legal challenge. The workers had already pried part of the hatch loose. Inside, they saw steps, brick-lined, descending. Samuel's composure fractured for the first time in public memory. Witnesses described his voice as sharp, urgent. He offered compensation to the workers to abandon further excavation. The constable ordered the site temporarily sealed pending review by magistrates. Word spread quickly. For years, suspicion had hovered. There was physical evidence. Chamber beneath the marsh, reinforced, hidden. That night, before any official inspection could occur, fire erupted on the property, not in the house, but near the exposed trench. Flames consumed timber supports. Smoke thickened the air. By morning, the hatch had collapsed inward. The chamber flooded with tidal water. Inspection became impossible. Accident, Samuel claimed. Lantern knocked over during repair. Tragic timing, convenient destruction. But something survived. As the water receded days later, debris washed toward the shoreline. Among it, a small metal strongbox. Dented, half open. A young apprentice carpenter found it lodged between reeds. Inside were documents, sealed in oilcloth, protected from water. He brought them not to Samuel, not to the constable, but to a minister known for strict moral stance against corruption. Within the oilcloth were ledgers, not of molasses, not of timber, but of payments. Payments from individuals bearing official titles. Customs inspector, assistant to the governor, military quartermaster. Next to each name, coded amounts, and a single recurring notation. WW, no explanation, just initials. Repeated beside large sums. The minister, trembling, recognized at least two names. Respected men, publicly pious, privately compensated. The discovery changed everything, because corruption was no longer rumor. It was documented. The weight of the era pressed down like stone, religious revival, political tension, economic greed, and beneath it all, a hidden chamber now flooded but no longer invisible. The Ashford family's power had relied on secrecy. Secrecy now floated in plain sight. In Part 3, we will decode the initials WW. We will trace the strongbox documents to a figure whose authority reached beyond Boston. And we will confront the question Jonathan Mercer may have died trying to answer. Was Samuel Ashford architect or instrument? For now, the marsh keeps its silence, but the ledger has begun to speak. The strongbox did not remain secret for long. Secrets in colonial Boston had a way of traveling through walls. The minister who received the oilcloth-wrapped ledgers did not sleep that night. He read them twice, then a third time. Each entry listed payments made under coded headings, harbor adjustments, insurance equalization, expedited clearance. The amounts were too precise to be charitable donations. Beside the largest sums were the initials, WW, no titles, no signatures, just repetition. And repetition suggests authority. By morning, the minister had hidden the documents beneath loose floorboards in his study. He intended to consult a trusted colleague. But when he stepped outside at dawn, he noticed something that unsettled him. A man across the street, not a parishioner, not a merchant he recognized, standing still, watching the house. When their eyes met, the man tipped his hat slightly, then walked away without hurry. Surveillance in colonial America did not look like modern espionage. It looked like neighbors lingering too long, like unfamiliar faces in pews, like letters arriving already opened. By noon, two more strangers attended prayer service. They sat in the rear. They did not sing. They did not bow their heads. They observed. The minister understood then that possession of the strongbox had not gone unnoticed. Someone had been watching the marsh that day. Someone had tracked the debris. Someone knew documents had surfaced. Someone was waiting to see where they would land. Samuel Ashford did not appear publicly for 3 days after the fire. His absence created noise. Dock workers whispered. Merchants speculated. Abigail Ashford continued attending church, her posture upright, her face composed. But those seated near her claimed her hands trembled during hymns. Rumors suggested Samuel had taken ill. A fever, they said. Colonial fevers were common. Typhus, influenza, consumption, illness provided plausible cover for retreat. Yet no physician publicly confirmed his condition, and no one outside the household saw him. Meanwhile, the minister who held the ledgers began receiving subtle warnings. A package left at his door. Inside, a single dead crow. No note, no signature. It's just implication. In Puritan symbolism, crows carried biblical weight. Omen, judgment, or reminder. He burned the crow without comment. But that night, as wind moved through narrow streets, he heard footsteps outside his study window, slow, measured, pausing, then continuing. The ledgers beneath the floorboards seemed heavier with each passing hour. He knew he could not keep them. To whom could he turn? Colonial magistrates were listed in the payments. Customs inspectors were implicated. Even a military quartermaster's name appeared beside coded sums. Corruption was not peripheral, it was embedded. The initials WW became obsession. Who held enough authority to collect from inspectors and officers alike? Who operated high enough above colonial politics to remain insulated? The answer began to form in whispers. There was, at that time, a man in Massachusetts whose influence extended beyond Boston's harbor. A wealthy landowner, a political intermediary. A man aligned with both crown officials and powerful merchant families. His full name does not appear in the surviving ledger fragment, but records from 1746 list a William Wentworth acting as advisor in matters of trade compliance across New England. Wentworth, WW, the connection was circumstantial. But in colonial society, circumstantial evidence could ignite rebellion. The minister dared not speak the name aloud. Instead, he wrote a coded letter to a distant colleague in Salem. He avoided direct references. He described an imbalance in harbor accounts. He requested counsel regarding a man whose initials repeat. The letter was sealed carefully, delivered by a trusted courier. It never arrived. 3 days later, the courier returned, beaten. He claimed highwaymen intercepted him outside town. But his pockets were untouched, his horse unharmed. Only the letter was gone. Surveillance had evolved into interception. Someone knew the minister was reaching outward. Back at the Ashford residence, construction resumed quietly. Despite the flooded chamber, laborers reinforced the foundation once more, brick by brick, timber by timber, as if rebuilding not merely structure but secrecy. Neighbors reported seeing crates carried from the cellar at night. Crates smaller than those unloaded at the harbor. Heavier, sealed, transported by cart under tarps toward the waterfront. Where they went, no one recorded. Jonathan Mercer's name resurfaced unexpectedly in this period. A fragment of correspondence discovered decades later suggests he had not died. He had relocated southward to Newport. Newport was known for looser trade oversight, a haven for merchants who navigated legal gray zones. If Mercer had fled Boston, perhaps he sought distance from Ashford influence, or perhaps he continued investigating from afar. One surviving note attributed to Mercer reads, "The rot does not end with the marsh. It spreads through ledgers like mildew through timber." He understood something critical. The Ashford network was not isolated corruption. It was infrastructure. A system sustained by mutual benefit and mutual silence. And systems defend themselves. Abigail Ashford fell ill in early 1749. Not violently, not dramatically, but persistently. Fatigue, pale complexion, interrupted sleep. The town physician diagnosed nervous exhaustion. Servants whispered of arguments overheard behind closed doors. Samuel's voice raised. Abigail pleading caution. Had she discovered the contents of the strongbox before it vanished? Had she confronted her husband? Or was her illness unrelated, coincidence layered atop suspicion? Psychological tension in colonial households often remained hidden. Public composure masked private fracture. The minister holding the ledgers sensed time collapsing. He confided cautiously in a younger deacon known for strict moral clarity. He did not reveal names, only initials. The deacon listened, then asked a question that lingered. "If those initials belong to the man you fear, do you believe exposing him will cleanse the colony or tear it apart?" It was not rhetorical. Massachusetts in the late 1740s stood at fragile equilibrium. War expenditures strained resources. Revivalist preachers divided congregations. Trade disputes simmered. To reveal high-level corruption could ignite unrest, but to conceal it preserved decay. The minister's internal conflict mirrored Mercer's years earlier: duty versus stability, truth versus consequence. And then came the coded warning. One evening, as he returned home, the minister found a scrap of parchment tucked into his coat pocket. He had not placed it there. The message was brief. "You are not the only one who reads the margins." No signature. But the handwriting matched entries within the Ashford ledger. Someone inside the network knew he possessed the documents. And that someone was close enough to slip a note into his pocket unnoticed. Trust evaporated. Even his own household felt uncertain. Servants moved quietly. Doors closed softly. Every creak of timber sounded intentional. In Boston's narrow streets, watchers multiplied. Men leaning against tavern walls, carriages passing slower than necessary, eyes tracking movement from church to home. Samuel Ashford reappeared publicly at a merchant gathering weeks later. He looked thinner, paler, but composed. He spoke little. He listened more. Observers noted a new caution in his posture, as if recalibrating strategy. If he suspected the ledgers survived, he would seek them relentlessly. If he believed the minister held them, he would apply pressure indirectly. Power rarely attacks openly. It constricts. The deacon who had been confided in began experiencing headaches, persistent, debilitating. He attributed them to stress. Until one evening, after drinking cider at a public house, he collapsed. Not dead, but delirious. The physician suggested contaminated drink, accidental spoilage. Yet others who drank from the same barrel remained unaffected. Selective illness can be coincidence or warning. The minister understood the escalation. This was no longer abstract corruption. This was intimidation, measured, incremental, psychological, and effective. He resolved to act before further harm occurred. He retrieved the ledgers from beneath his floorboards. He copied key entries by candlelight. Names, amounts, initials. He concealed the originals within a hollowed Babula volume rarely questioned in a minister's possession. Then he arranged a meeting, not with magistrates, not with merchants, but with a visiting preacher known for fiery sermons against moral compromise, a man whose influence over congregations rivaled political authority. If the pulpit could not prosecute corruption, it could expose it. The meeting was set for midnight. Neutral ground. An unused warehouse near the harbor.
What?
Quran. I will bear wind. I will wide I had.
He waited among crates smelling of salt and tar. Footsteps approached. 2 sets. Not one. The preacher entered. Behind him, a shadowed figure paused in the doorway. The preacher's expression held apology, not defiance. The shadow stepped forward into lantern light. Samuel Ashford. Alive, composed, eyes steady, he had known, he had anticipated. The minister's heart pounded against ribcage. The hollowed Bible felt heavier than iron. Samuel spoke calmly. You should not have involved the pulpit. No raised voice, no threats, just certainty. The preacher avoided eye contact. Betrayal rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives cloaked in persuasion. The preacher believed exposure would fracture the colony. Samuel had convinced him that order required silence. The minister understood in that moment the true antagonist was not merely an individual, it was alignment. An alliance between commerce, governance, and selective morality, and he was alone. Outside, the harbor tide shifted. Lantern light flickered. Samuel stepped closer, not aggressive, not hurried, measured. Give me what you recovered, he said softly. No resolution, no violence, just an imminent decision. The minister tightened his grip on the Bible. Behind Samuel, unseen in the darkness, beyond the warehouse door, another figure watched, unidentified, still, as if history itself waited to record what would happen next. And if you think this is where the truth surfaces, you are wrong. Because the confrontation about to unfold will not only decide the fate of a ledger, it will determine whether the Ashford network tightens its grip or begins to fracture from within. In Part 4, the exchange in that warehouse will trigger consequences no one anticipates. And one hidden observer will carry knowledge that could unravel everything. Stay with this story, because the next revelation cannot be reconstructed once missed. The tide is turning, and someone will not leave that warehouse unchanged. The warehouse did not erupt in violence. It did not echo with shouts. No pistols were drawn, no fists thrown. Instead, there was silence. A silence so precise it felt constructed. The harbor tide shifted against timber pilings outside. Ship's mast creaked in the distance. Lantern light swayed gently between 3 men who understood that the next word spoken would alter more than reputations. This was not a duel. It was a reckoning. When, like the dramatic midpoint of a long, unfolding epic, time seemed to suspend itself. No one moved. No one blinked. Even history appeared to hold its breath. The minister stood with the hollowed Bible pressed to his chest. He had not intended to become a conspirator. His background had been modest. Born to a cooper in Boston, raised within the rigid discipline of Puritan doctrine, educated in scripture rather than politics. His sermons were measured, his temperament restrained, his strength lay in conviction. His weakness lay in isolation. He believed corruption could be corrected by exposure, that sin once revealed would trigger repentance. But he had underestimated how power adapts. He had underestimated Samuel Ashford, perhaps more dangerously. He had underestimated himself. Because beneath his calm exterior lived a man who feared disorder more than injustice. If the ledger's contents surfaced publicly, the consequences would be seismic. Customs officials implicated. Military quartermasters exposed. The name W.W., potentially tied to William Wentworth, a figure whose influence extended across trade networks and advisory councils. The colony could fracture. Faith in institutions could collapse. The minister's moral conflict crystallized in that moment. Was truth an absolute, or was it contextual? Samuel Ashford stood opposite him, composed. Measured, he did not resemble a villain. He resembled a man who had calculated every possible outcome and prepared contingencies for each. His background was less documented than assumed, though he claimed origins in Bristol. No parish record there confirms his birth. No extended relatives ever surfaced in Massachusetts. His father's shipping credentials appeared abruptly in 1728, fully formed. Samuel had grown up not as an insider, but as an outsider, watching, learning, studying the architecture of colonial power. His strength was perception. He understood that colonial America between 1700 and 1750 was not a unified moral entity. It was a fragile ecosystem. Merchants needed governors. Governors needed revenue. Revenue required trade flexibility. Trade flexibility required selective blindness. Samuel did not see himself as corrupt. He saw himself as stabilizing, smuggling. He called it adjustment. Insurance manipulation. He called it balance. Payments to officials. Called them incentives that prevented harsher crown intervention. His belief system was not chaotic, it was utilitarian. To preserve the colony's prosperity. Prevent London from tightening its grip. Protect local autonomy by bending rules quietly rather than breaking them publicly. In his mind, he was not a criminal. He was a mediator. And mediators, he believed, must operate in shadow. Behind Samuel stood the visiting preacher. His loyalty had shifted not out of greed but fear of schism. The First Great Awakening had already fractured congregations across New England. Emotional revivalism clashed with traditional clergy authority. Families divided, parishes splintered. He had witnessed towns nearly collapse under theological conflict. When Samuel approached him privately weeks earlier, speaking not of ledgers, but of stability, he listened. Expose it, he argued, and the crown would respond with stricter enforcement. Trade would suffer, jobs would vanish, militias would lose funding. And Boston, already strained by war expenditures, could descend into economic chaos. The preacher feared that outcome more than hidden payments, so he stood now in silence, not proud, but resolved. Loyalty and fear are often indistinguishable in dim light. Outside the warehouse, unseen, a fourth figure remained in shadow. A young dock clerk named Elias Turner, K. Bagel, Ashford's cousin. He had followed Samuel that night out of suspicion, not loyalty. Elias had noticed discrepancies in cargo weights months earlier. He had seen ships declared lost that later reappeared under new names. He had said nothing, because Samuel employed him, because Samuel funded his family's debts, because fear of unemployment in colonial Boston carried real consequence. But tonight, curiosity overcame caution. He watched through a crack in the timber wall, listening, memorizing. Power, he was beginning to realize, rested not only in possession of documents, but in knowledge of who sought them. Gestai, the minister, finally spoke. "You have corrupted men sworn to justice." Samuel did not flinch. "I have prevented worse corruption," he replied calmly. "The crown would drain this harbor dry if given cause. I ensure cause is never visible." "You purchased silence," the minister pressed. "I purchased flexibility." The distinction lingered in air like smoke. This was the midpoint, the interval, not explosive, but decisive. The audience, both within the warehouse and beyond the walls of history, stood between narratives. Was Samuel parasite or protector? Was the minister naive or courageous? Moral clarity dissolved into ambiguity. The dramatic revelation arrived, not in accusation, but in confession. Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The initials trouble you," he said. The minister stiffened. Samuel continued. "WW does not stand for William Wentworth." Silence deepened. "It stands for Western Warehouse." He gestured subtly toward the harbor. "A crown-sanctioned reserve for goods rerouted to avoid French interception during wartime?" The minister's breath slowed. You expect me to believe these payments were official? Not official, Samuel corrected. It's necessary. He explained that during escalating tensions with France, certain supplies, iron, gunpowder, preserved rations, were redirected quietly through private channels to prevent seizure at sea. If recorded publicly, such diversions would invite scrutiny. Concealed entirely, they risked accusations of smuggling. So coded accounts were created. Payments ensured cooperation. Insurance claims balanced losses. Hidden systems supporting wartime logistics without parliamentary entanglement. The minister's grip on the Bible weakened. If Samuel spoke truth, exposure would not merely shame corrupt officials. It would reveal covert colonial defense strategies, could be construed as treason against the crown. The power dynamic shifted subtly. The minister had believed he held evidence of sin. Now he faced evidence of clandestine survival. Moral certainty fractured, yet doubt persisted. Why hide the chamber? He asked. Samuel's eyes flickered momentarily. Because some goods were not military, some shipments extended beyond sanctioned necessity. Samuel did not say this aloud. But Elias Turner, outside, had seen crates moved long after war supplies stabilized. He had seen coin exchanged independent of militia contracts. The Western warehouse explanation covered much, but not all, and Samuel knew it. His justification blended truth with omission, which is the most effective form of manipulation. The minister's weakness surfaced again. He feared destabilization. He feared being remembered as the man who shattered fragile order. Samuel sensed that fear. "You can end this tonight," Samuel said softly. "Turn what you found. Let the system function. The colony remains stable. Your congregation remains whole. And the payments, they continue where required." The preacher shifted uneasily. He now realized he stood inside a negotiation far more complex than moral compromise. He saw layers he had not anticipated. The harbor wind intensified outside. Elias Turner strained to hear. He caught only fragments. Necessary. War. Stability. He felt his own moral conflict forming, his loyalty to family, his fear of poverty. His emerging suspicion that Samuel's explanation, though plausible, was incomplete. The interval stretched. No one moved. Lantern light cast elongated shadows across the floorboards. The hollowed Bible between the minister's hands felt less like evidence and more like burden. Then Samuel made a final appeal. "History is not written by men who shout truth in empty streets," he said quietly. "It is written by those who ensure the streets remain standing." The minister looked at him for a long moment. He saw intelligence, calculation, belief, not cruelty, which made the choice harder. The dramatic midpoint crystallized. Power had shifted not through violence but through perspective. The minister no longer held unilateral moral authority. He held a volatile mixture of truth and uncertainty. Expose the ledger, and he risked chaos. Suppress it, and he risked complicity. And then a subtle sound. Timber shifting. Outside the warehouse wall. Samuel's head turned slightly. Elias froze. For the first time that night, Samuel's composure cracked, not with fear, but alertness. He was accustomed to hidden watchers. He had become powerful by anticipating them. The minister followed Samuel's gaze. Someone else had heard. Someone else now carried fragments of truth. The equilibrium trembled. This was no longer a private moral debate. It was containment versus exposure in motion. Samuel could not control every variable. The minister could not undo what had already spread. Elias Turner's silent presence outside introduced unpredictability. And unpredictability threatened systems built on secrecy. The interval ended not with explosion but with decision. The minister stepped back. He opened the Bible. He removed the copied pages, not the originals. He held them over the lantern flame. For a brief second, the paper caught light. Samuel watched carefully. The preacher swallowed hard. Elias outside saw the flicker through the crack. The copies burned. Ash drifted to the warehouse floor. The original ledger pages remained hidden within the hollowed binding, unseen, undeclared. The minister closed the Bible slowly, his face no longer conflicted but resolved. "You are right about one thing," he said quietly. "Streets must remain standing." Samuel exhaled almost imperceptibly. "But foundations built in shadow cannot endure forever." The words hung heavy. This was not surrender. It was strategy. The minister had made a bold decision. He would not expose the ledger publicly. Not yet. He would gather more, confirm more, test Samuel's claims, and when the moment arrived, he would choose not chaos, but precision. Outside, Elias Turner stepped backward into darkness, carrying partial truth and growing suspicion. Inside, 3 men stood in courtroom silence. No verdict delivered, but a new trial begun. And somewhere beneath the rebuilt marshland, brick and water concealed a chamber whose full purpose remained unspoken. The interval had ended. The confrontation had transformed. And the next move would not belong to Samuel alone. It would belong to a man who had decided to fight differently. Boston did not know it was standing on a fault line, but it felt the tremor, not in the earth, in the air. Conversations shortened when certain names were spoken. Merchants who once dined openly now met in smaller rooms. Harbor inspections grew suddenly meticulous. Custom officers who once laughed with dock workers began carrying ledgers tucked tightly beneath their arms. Something had shifted. No announcement had been made, no scandal declared. Yet the colony moved as if anticipating impact. The first public ripple came from the pulpit. The minister who had stood inside the warehouse returned to his church the following Sabbath. His sermon text was drawn from the book of Proverbs. Unequal weights and unequal measures are both alike an abomination. The congregation listened. Merchants shifted in their pews. Customs officials kept their eyes forward. He did not mention names. He did not reference ledgers. But he spoke of hidden balances, of scales tipped quietly in back rooms, of justice delayed not by ignorance but by convenience. The message was unmistakable. Truth was circling. And those who benefited from imbalance felt exposed even without accusation. Samuel Ashford attended. He did not react. But Abigail, seated beside him, kept her gaze lowered the entire service. Her illness had not improved. Her pallor had deepened. And in private she had begun asking questions Samuel did not answer. The second ripple struck the harbor. A junior customs officer, newly appointed, ambitious, eager to impress, ordered an unexpected inspection of one of Ashford's vessels. For instance, officially, it carried timber and preserved cod bound for Newport. Dockworkers groaned. Inspections slowed profit. But this officer was thorough. Crates were opened, weights compared, tallies recalculated, and beneath stacked barrels of cod, he found something unusual. Iron ingots, marked with a crown stamp, not currently authorized for civilian trade. Military supply, undeclared. Samuel was summoned to the harbor. He arrived calm, as always, examined the ingots. He nodded once. They were misfiled, he said evenly. Reserved for militia transport. Documentation delayed. The junior officer hesitated. Samuel's explanation proved false. The penalty would be severe. If it proved true, the officer would appear foolish. He chose caution. He confiscated the ingots, filed a preliminary report, and forwarded it not to a local magistrate but to the governor's council. That choice changed everything. Political councils in colonial Massachusetts were not theatrical assemblies. They were quiet rooms, wood-paneled, candles burning low, men in powdered wigs speaking in measured tones. Samuel was called before them 3 nights later. No public announcement, no formal charge, but questions were precise. Why were crown-stamped ingots on a private merchant vessel? Why was documentation incomplete? Why had multiple insurance claims in previous years coincided with similar cargo discrepancies? Samuel answered carefully. He invoked wartime logistics. He referenced private agreements. He mentioned the necessity of discreet supply rerouting during periods of French naval interception. One councilman older, reserved, asked a single question. Who authorized this discretion? The room held still. Samuel did not say Western Warehouse. He did not say William Wentworth. He said only those who understood the cost of delay. It was neither confirmation nor denial. It was a reminder. The council adjourned without verdict. But the conversation had moved beyond whispers. Power structures were now acknowledging irregularity. The third ripple came unexpectedly. Elias Turner, the dock clerk who had overheard the warehouse exchange. He had remained silent for weeks, observing, comparing cargo lists, copying small details into a personal notebook. He was not a hero. He was afraid. Samuel had employed him, funded his family's debts, protected his reputation. But Elias had also seen Abigail's deteriorating condition. He had heard her arguing softly with Samuel one night when delivering invoices. He had heard her say, "If the truth comes out, it will not be only you who falls." That sentence haunted him because it suggested knowledge and fear. Elias made a choice. He approached the minister not publicly, not dramatically, but with a folded paper containing copied cargo weights from the Providence inspection. Numbers that did not align with Samuel's explanation. The minister listened in silence. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Samuel's system blended legitimate wartime necessity with private enrichment, a partial truth masking a deeper scheme. The moral ambiguity that once paralyzed the minister began clarifying. This was no longer about stability alone. It was about exploitation layered atop emergency. Public tension escalated when the junior customs officer's report was leaked, not officially, but through tavern rumor. By the end of the week, Boston buzzed with speculation. Was Ashford smuggling for the crown? Or from it? Was he protecting the colony or profiting from its vulnerability? Merchants began distancing themselves publicly. Invitations to dinners declined. Business meetings postponed. Social isolation, the colony's most subtle punishment, began closing around Samuel. Abigail's illness worsened under the strain. She stopped attending church, stopped hosting gatherings, stopped appearing at all. Then she made her own decision. Without informing Samuel, she requested a private meeting with the minister. When she arrived at the parsonage, her hands trembled visibly. Her voice, however, did not. "He believes he is saving this colony," she said quietly. "But he has begun saving himself more." She did not provide documents. She did not confess complicity. But she confirmed something critical. Samuel's early operations had indeed been tied to covert wartime supply. Over time, as trust and access grew, he expanded beyond necessity. Insurance manipulation increased. Private shipments piggybacked on military cover. Payments grew larger. The system that began as strategic adaptation evolved into personal empire, and the initials WW, not merely Western Warehouse, but a coded dual meaning. William Wentworth had approved early diversions. Later payments were no longer sanctioned. They were tribute. A powerful man ensuring silence. The conspiracy was layered. Part official, part parasitic, part patriotic, part predatory. And now pieces of it existed in three places. In Samuel's mind. In the minister's hallowed Bible, and in Elias Turner's notebook, the governor's council reconvened. This time, more members present. They summoned Samuel again. But before proceedings began, an unexpected development. The junior customs officer who had initiated the Providence inspection collapsed in his boarding house. Sudden fever, convulsions, dead within 2 days. Physician's verdict, acute infection. Unremarkable, tragic, but timing reshaped perception. Was it coincidence? Colonial medicine offered no forensic certainty, but whispers filled the void. The officer had been healthy, young, ambitious, now buried. Fear spread faster than accusation. If Samuel had orchestrated intimidation before, had he escalated? Or had someone above him ensured silence? The council hesitated to press further. Because if corruption extended upward, exposure would implicate not one merchant, but the structure itself. Public gatherings intensified, taverns filled with debate. Some defended Samuel. He kept trade flowing when the crown would have strangled it. Others condemned him. He siphoned coin while soldiers starved. The minister delivered another sermon, this one sharper. He spoke of King David flawed yet accountable, spoke of hidden sin, revealed not by mobs, but by chosen moment. He did not name Samuel, but everyone understood. Abigail did not attend. Instead, that same evening, she disappeared. No note. No public farewell. Servants claimed she left before dawn with a small trunk and hired carriage. Destination unknown. Samuel remained composed publicly. Privately, cracks widened. He visited the harbor at odd hours, met with unknown men in dark cloaks, sent letters sealed heavily in wax. Elias noticed increased surveillance around the Ashford property. More watchers, more movement at night. The system felt threatened, and threatened systems react unpredictably. The shocking turning point arrived not in courtroom or council, but in fire. 3 nights after Abigail's disappearance, the minister's church ignited. Flames erupted from the vestry first, then climbed toward the wooden steeple. Congregants rushed with buckets. The blaze spread too quickly, too deliberately. At dawn, the meeting house stood charred, blackened beams against gray sky. Inside the rubble, the minister searched for one thing: the hollowed Bible. He found it half-burned, charred edges, but intact. He opened it. The ledger pages were gone, moved before the fire consumed the building. Not destroyed. Taken. Someone had known exactly where to look. The documents were no longer his leverage. They were in unknown hands. Samuel had not attended the fire. He'd been seen that night at the governor's residence, meeting privately. When news reached him, he expressed solemn regret, but no surprise. The colony now stood at a precipice. Customs officer dead. A church burned. A merchant under scrutiny. A governor silent. A missing wife. And a vanished ledger. This was no longer about one man. It was about whether colonial society could confront its own shadow without tearing itself apart. And as smoke drifted above Boston's rooftops, a sealed letter arrived at the governor's council. No return mark. Inside, one surviving ledger page, and beneath the initials WW, written boldly in fresh ink proof. The next episode would not be about suspicion. It would be about accusation, because whoever held the remaining pages had chosen escalation. And nothing in Boston would remain controlled for long. The letter arrived without ceremony. No herald, no signature. Just wax pressed flat and urgent. Inside the governor's council chamber, the air felt heavier than usual. The smoke from the burned meeting house still lingered over Boston like a bruise that refused to fade. The council broke the seal. A single ledger page unfolded across the polished wood. Beneath columns of figures carefully inked, deliberate, were the initials WW, and beneath them, in a different hand, darker ink. Proof. No explanation, no accusation, just certainty. The room fell silent, because this was no longer rumor. No longer pulpit suggestion, no longer tavern speculation. It was documentation placed directly into the machinery of governance, and whoever sent it had chosen their battlefield carefully. Samuel Ashford was summoned before the council one final time, not privately, not quietly, but publicly. Word spread quickly through town. A merchant of standing called to answer for corruption before the colony's highest authorities. Crowds gathered outside the council building. Dockworkers stood beside merchants, servants beside magistrates' wives. The burned remains of the church stood visible down the street, a charred reminder that something sacred had already been lost. Samuel arrived in dark coat and powdered wig, composed, measured, but thinner, his eyes sharper than before. Inside, the council chamber felt less like a political room and more like a courtroom awaiting verdict. The ledger page lay displayed on the table. "Do you recognize this document?" one councilman asked. Samuel looked down. He did not hesitate. "Yes." "And the initials?" Samuel inhaled once. "Western Warehouse," he said evenly. A murmur moved through the chamber. "And the annotation marked proof." Samuel's gaze lifted. "That is not my hand." "Truth?" "At least partially." The council pressed further. "Questions about the providence, questions about insurance claims, questions about payments made to customs officials and quartermasters." Samuel answered with precision. He did not deny the system existed. He reframed it. Yes, payments were made. Yes, cargo was redirected. Yes, documentation was incomplete. But he argued necessity. He described French naval threats, described supply shortages, described delays that could have crippled militia defenses during wartime. He reminded them that the colony had survived those years, that trade had continued, that soldiers had been provisioned, and at what cost? A younger councilman demanded. Samuel paused. "At the cost of purity," he replied quietly. The admission stunned the room. Not denial, not deflection. Confession filtered through justification. Outside, the crowd grew restless. Rumors filtered through open windows. Some defended him, kept our harbor alive. Others condemned him, lined his pockets while preaching stability. Inside, another figure entered the chamber. Unexpected, uninvited. Elias Turner, the dock clerk. Nervous, but resolute, he carried a small, leather-bound notebook. He requested permission to speak. The council hesitated, but granted it. Elias presented his copies of cargo weights, shipping manifests. Dates that did not align with Samuel's wartime explanation. These shipments occurred after hostilities had subsided, he said carefully. After French interception risk had declined, the room shifted. Samuel watched Elias steadily, not angry, not surprised, almost disappointed. The council turned back to Samuel. Were you still redirecting goods under wartime authority after the threat diminished? Silence. This was the fracture point. Samuel could continue defending partial truth, or he could step into full light. He chose the latter. Yes, the word hung like smoke. Yes, he repeated. The system worked, provided flexibility, it provided revenue, prevented crown overreach, and enriched you, the younger councilman added. Samuel did not answer immediately. Then yes, not shouted, not whispered, acknowledged. There it was. The main arc exposed. A system born in necessity, extended by ambition, justified by belief, corrupted by opportunity. But the confrontation was not finished. Another letter was presented, recovered from the burned church ruins days earlier. Charred at the edges, but legible. It bore the signature of William Wentworth, not coded, not initialed. A private directive authorizing limited wartime diversions through Ashford's vessels years earlier. The authorization ended at a specific date.
After that,
no sanction. The initials WW in later ledger entries had no official protection. Samuel had continued alone. The revelation severed his final shield. He had once acted under quiet approval, had later acted under personal conviction. The line between patriot and profiteer had been crossed deliberately. The council adjourned briefly. When they returned, the verdict was not theatrical. Samuel Ashford was stripped of his shipping licenses, his assets seized pending further review. No public execution, no gallows. The colony did not wish to amplify scandal. Instead, exile, permanent removal from Massachusetts jurisdiction. Effective, silent, erasing influence without martyring the man. Samuel listened without visible reaction. His guard stepped forward. He raised one final request. To speak, permission granted. He did not plead. He did not beg. He addressed the council and through them, the colony. You call this corruption, he said evenly. Perhaps it is. But understand this your prosperity rested on the flexibility you now condemn. He gestured toward the harbor beyond the chamber walls. Your ships sailed because I bent rules. Your militias ate because I moved goods quietly. You will now pretend virtue was always intact. His gaze shifted toward the council members individually. But when the next crisis arrives and London tightens its fist, remember what you sacrificed. Silence answered him, because beneath indignation lay uncomfortable truth. Power often depends on compromise, and compromise leaves residue. Samuel Ashford was escorted out. The crowd parted. Some spat, some stared, some watched with conflicted expression. He did not resist. By sunset, he was aboard a vessel bound south. No one recorded where he ultimately settled. No parish registry confirms his death. He vanished as quietly as he had once arrived. In the months that followed, Boston changed. Customs oversight tightened. Insurance protocols restructured. The Governor's Council issued new transparency measures regarding wartime logistics. Merchants grew cautious. Some resented the scrutiny. Others welcomed clarity. The burned meeting house was rebuilt. Stronger timber, wider windows. A visible symbol of renewal. The minister resumed preaching, but his sermons changed. Less fire, more humility. He spoke often of King David again, not as warning, but reminder that flawed men can shape history. And history rarely presents clean hands. Elias Turner was offered a modest administrative role within harbor inspections. Not a reward, not punishment, but acknowledgement. He carried his notebook always, and wrote more carefully thereafter. As for Abigail, months after Samuel's exile, a letter arrived from Newport, short measured. She had chosen separation, not out of hatred, but fatigue. She wrote, he believed he could control the tide, but tides answered to no man. No further correspondence followed. Her fate remains recorded only in that final letter. The long-term consequences rippled outward. Years later, when tensions with Britain escalated toward revolution, Boston's merchants remembered the Ashford affair. Some argued stricter adherence to Crown law was folly. Others argued corruption invited exploitation. The debate influenced how trade networks aligned during the years leading to open rebellion. History books would later simplify the era into slogans: liberty, taxation, independence. But beneath those slogans lay quieter lessons learned in warehouses and council chambers. Lessons about systems, about compromise, about how easily necessity becomes excuse. The marshland near the Ashford property remained undeveloped for decades. Locals avoided it, claimed the soil was unstable, too wet, too uncertain. Beneath its surface, the original chamber flooded, collapsed, was never fully excavated. No official inventory recorded what it once held. Some say it stored only redirected goods. Others whisper of separate crates, never listed in any ledger. Artifacts, documents, gold, or something less tangible. Intent. Because what is truly buried in such foundations is not always physical. It is precedent. It is the quiet understanding that power can operate in shadow when urgency demands it, and that those shadows once formed rarely disappear completely. Samuel Ashford's name faded from public memory within a generation. But the system he helped refine, covert negotiation between authority and profit, did not vanish. It evolved, as all systems do. The minister lived long enough to see revolution stir openly. He never spoke publicly of the ledger again. But in private writings, discovered long after his death, he reflected, "Faith must not blind us to corruption, nor must fear of disorder blind us to truth. Between those dangers lies accountability." The colony survived. The harbor thrived. The crown eventually fell away, but the questions remained. Was Samuel villain, visionary, or merely product of an era that demanded moral flexibility? History rarely grants absolution. It grants consequence, and sometimes mystery, because one question still lingers. Who sent the final annotated ledger page to the council? It was not Elias. He denied it. It was not the minister. His copy had burned. It was not Samuel. He had nothing to gain. Someone else held access to those pages. Someone who chose not exposure for spectacle, but exposure for leverage. That identity was never confirmed, and perhaps that is fitting, because power never concentrates in one pair of hands alone. It circulates, adapts, waits. The rebuilt church stands today only in record. The council chamber long since remodeled. The marshland paved over by time, but beneath that soil brick remains. Water seeps through collapsed stone, and memory settles like silt. Faith can inspire courage. Corruption can disguise itself as necessity. Power can convince itself it serves the greater good. And accountability, when it finally arrives, rarely satisfies completely. It simply marks a line in history. A line that says, "Here, we chose differently." The tide moves on. The harbor reflects a new sky. But somewhere beneath the foundations once laid in secrecy, something remains unanswered. What do you believe was truly buried beneath those foundations?